Hi, everybody. We'll just start in a minute or two. We're just sort of getting the last setup and then letting a couple more people filter in. Good morning, everyone. We're just confirming the recording is starting, and then we'll get started in a minute. Okay, everybody. Welcome to the latest Extractives-led Local Economic Diversification Community of Practice webinar. Thrilled to all have you, both members of the community and not. For a bit of background, the ELLED COP is an online forum and resource center bringing together the world's sort of leading stakeholders and representatives of governments, civil society, private sector, who work on issues of local content and seeking to diversify economies away from extractive industries in the host countries that host it. So we have an online community, which anyone who is not a member on the call would like to join can email myself or Kyla DeWert from our team. We can put that information up. And we tend to have webinars sort of every 2 to 3 months. Right now, we're actually in the second of a 3-part series on looking at local content at the subnational level. So obviously, local content policy strategy has debates are often dominated by discussions of kind of national policy, but actually a lot of the meat of the work gets done by provinces, by private sector initiatives like clusters. So this point of this series is to really kind of dive deeper into the practical steps that are taken by these actors to make local procurement, local hiring, and other economic linkages take place. So we're really thrilled to have you join us. Today we're focusing on the role of clusters, which to me is an exciting topic because everyone speaks about how clusters have economic benefits in terms of spillovers and knowledge transfers, but to be honest, we don't actually dive into the mechanics of that very much. So it's exciting to actually today go into that a little more in more detail and provide some practical policy relevant and private sector relevant material. So we've got 3 speakers to do that today. We have Emiliano Duque from the World Bank, who is going to sort of take us on a journey of a theoretical picture of clusters and how they work. And then we have 2 sort of cluster initiatives here with us to present on their own work, which we really hope can get into the weeds and details of making these things work. So first we have Alberto Orozco from the cluster mining cluster of Sonora in Mexico, which is a real private sector led initiative. And then we have Andres Mitnick from Expande Mineria from Chile, who has a very innovation focused and centered initiative in the mining sector to increase local procurement and particularly to increase the supplies of higher tech, higher innovation products. So both really exciting initiatives that I think the whole world can learn from. So that's kind of where we're at today. So I will then turn it over to Emiliano to start. And if you could just share your screen and take us away and unmute yourself, obviously. You have to unmute yourself and then just hit the slide show.
There you go. Can you hear me well now?
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Just maybe you just need to share your start your show.
Very
There.
good. So we just had a previous joke about that how everybody now has to unmute their phones and the difficulty to have that. That probably the most heard phrase during the pandemic is, unmute yourself. So let's go for it. The questions that were asked by the organizer were basically the role of clusters in extractive industries. How can cluster-based economic development strategies be pursued to leverage and extractive industries, and how clusters are organized and launched and sustained? So I felt that you already had given in the introduction on the leaflet you circulated, what are the good things of clusters and what clusters are. Clusters are these geographically collocated groups of concentrations enterprises, which fits very well with your resource-based clusters. And then the beauties of clusters, they increase productivity. They are the foundation of knowledge and help to stimulate technical innovation. This is nothing new. Alfred Marshall started talking about this, about knowledge being in the air in the Manchester in England during the textile revolution. So, and then afterwards, in Italy, it was developed by Professor Giacomo Peccatini, and then in the 90s was Michael Porter, which came to the idea, and with the pizza, which I suppose was invented by the Italians, whereas the Americans that they make it popular and they extend it all over the world. So even if the clusters were an Italian invention, the Americans brought it up and made it that everybody talk about clusters during the basically the last 20 years. But I think I wanted just here to say, be careful, because this is also a slide from Porter. Clusters are just one part of what it takes to make an economic competitiveness. So there are two big parts, which is the macroeconomic, political, legal, and social context. With in many cases we take for granted, but working in the environments that we work as World Bank, we should not take for granted that you have a macroeconomic stability, you have a political stability, you have a rule of law, and you have a proper social context with trade unions and with human rights and worker rights. So these are fundamental parts. Clusters is not going to make it alone. And then you go into the part which Porter calls the microeconomics of competitiveness, which it's a combination of having good companies, having a good business environment, and having a good cluster development. There are some countries which compensate one thing with another. Italy has a horrible business environment. It's typically around Jamaica on the doing business ranking, but has very good companies and has a very good state of cluster development. So sometimes these three factors compensate each other, but at the end, it is the relationship between all of them. So I just wanted to put this warning to say, be careful thinking that clusters is a panacea, and just with clusters you're going to make it. And then let's go to clusters. So if you go to the book that Porter wrote in 1990, and 1990 is really long time ago. It was before, it was the year before Tiananmen, and it was the year after the fall of the wall in Berlin. So the world was very different. It was not as global as we think now. We think of a very globalized world. At that time, it wasn't. So one of the big discoveries of clusters and why this book was written was when Japan was the threat to the United States competitiveness. And the response to that was say, well, Japan is not good at everything, but it has pockets of goodness in certain locations, and they have these clusters in locations. And we know that they make electronics in Osaka and automotive in Nagoya, and all the motorcycles that make in Hamamatsu, which is a very small town of 1 million people by Japanese standards. So this idea that knowledge was concentrated not at the level of a country, was not the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Japan, which was planning the success of Japan. There were very little pockets of knowledge. But of course, to explain that, in fact, he didn't choose in the book a Japanese example, but he took an Italian example. And he took a resource-based cluster, basically the Italian ceramic tile industry, which, to his surprise, was at that time producing 30% of the world production of ceramic tiles and 60% of the world exports of ceramic tiles. So he sent Michael Enright, one of his PhD students, and Paolo Tenti, which was working for Monitor Company in the Milan office, and they look at this cluster. The discovering of this cluster was not something so difficult because if you take, they didn't have Google Maps at that time, but if you take a Google map and you look at from the sky, you could see clearly that here on the bottom, around Sassuolo, you can see all these big factories. It's a very, I use this cluster because it's a cluster you can see from a satellite, because every factory is about 1 kilometer long. So, because they have these continuous ovens, no? So you can see there is a clear concentration in the middle of an area. With, in Reggio Emilia, they make the Parmigiano Reggiano. So they have cows and cheese and pigs. But then all of a sudden you have this big industrial zone, big concentration of people, which is, a leading cluster in the world producing ceramic tiles. Why? All the factories here. For the car lovers about you can see here Sassuolo. All these are factories of ceramic tiles, except one here in Maranello that makes Ferraris. Okay, that's where the Ferrari factory is, right in the middle of all the ceramic tile factories. So they know something about mechanics in this area as well. It's not only about having the clay to do that. So why did this develop here? Is this a strategic location for a resource-based cluster? Actually, I'm going to show you this picture. This is the entrance with Google View as well to this place. It's a single lane bridge in a place where you have very heavy materials. So clearly this place was not chosen because of its connections. And in fact, the clay that they're using now is coming all the way from Ukraine. So they don't have any more their natural resource base. So the question is here, how these people were able to, originally they were there because there was the clay there. That's the reason, okay? But how they made the transfer from being the place where they were there because they were the clay, and the place where they still do, a large share of world exports, and don't have any natural resource anymore. And the same things happen in Carrara. The famous Carrara marble today is not from Carrara. It comes from India, from everywhere. It comes there, they cut it, and they export it back to India. It's crazy. So what is the knowledge which is behind this, which these clusters have evolved from being purely resource-based to be based on the knowledge. So the key question here, how long does it take for these relationships and knowledge to become stronger than the natural resource? When do you switch from being a cluster that is there because they have clay, that the cluster that is there because there is knowledge on how to work that clay and make it into ceramic tiles, no? And here, the questions that you are asking is, well, do local content policies help to do that? Is this the key to that? Or what are the policies that help to do that? So I'm going to discuss the idea of time. We may not know what exactly does it, but we also know how long it takes. I found this slide from one of your friends, Anglo-American, so which just give us an idea of what is the average life of a mine. Okay, so it goes from in a copper mine from 5 years to maximum 70 years, and metallurgy from 2 to 35 years, 24, 20 years, 17. So we're talking of that, in kind of the best cases, we can have a mine running for 2-3 decades maximum. Okay, and then is this what it takes for resource base to be changed into a real cluster? This is a meta study done with almost like 300 clusters that was done by Klaas van der Linde, a professor at the University of St. Gallen, that look at clusters age, and it's very curious that 15% of the clusters studied were established before 1750. So 1750. Okay. So if you can say that almost like 30% of the clusters were done before the Civil War, the American Civil War, were established before the American Civil War. So these things tend to be very old. It takes a long time to happen, these things, the clusters are not measured in decades, in years, they're measured in decades or centuries. So on average, European clusters are 100 to 150 years older than the US clusters. So this is, do our 30 years of a mine life are going to give us enough time to create one of these knowledge clusters? Let me look at something more recent. we only have data from the United States on clusters. There's a United States cluster mapping project, which is developed by Harvard University and by the US Department of Commerce. And by the way, there is also one for Mexico, which is developed by INEGI. So you could find the same thing in Mexico. And we can look from 1998 until now, what happened to mining clusters. This is for metal mining clusters. There are three categories: non-metal, metal, coal mining, and oil clusters. I just took the metal mining clusters as an example. And look at the disappearance. I mean, what it measures is the specialization of an area. That means that in this area, the blue areas, the dark blue, you have high employment specialization. That means a lot of people is working in mining in that area, and a high employment share. That means that you have more mining than everybody else in any other country in the United States. This is all the counties in the US. And you have high employment share, so that the mining is an important part of that county. Just look in these 20 years, how many have disappeared? Okay, so the lifespan of these things, these are blips in history. In economic history, there are blips. That's why you have all these ghost towns of mining towns in the West that you can visit and play Western movies. No, this is the reality. Okay, so this is the unfortunate reality that, like, Alberto and Andres have to fight with. This is going to last what is going to last. What can we do? What are the policies that we can do to make this last longer, or to take advantage of that period? Of course, the first thing we do is thinking of clusters, organizing in a cluster. Okay, make an organization that puts together the people in that area. But there are many dangers on that. And I just refer to our guru here, not me, the guru Adam Smith. He says that people of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in conspiracy against the public, or then in some contrivance to raise prices. So putting people that are working in the same business together not always will result in good things. And in fact, we did a study, and this is very pretentious of me to put my quote next to the one of Adam Smith, but to say, yes, we look at 20 years of experience of many of these clusters. And the reality is that we have many instances that these clusters have only served to perpetuate their organizations, to get public money, to become defensive, to protect the incumbents, to justify that, almost like, say, to blackmail governments, saying, we have these jobs here, you have to help us, otherwise they're going to disappear. But they have not really focused on creating that transition that we saw in Italy. I must say it's very important. The Italian government never did anything, will never do anything for its economy. So all those things were naturally done by, there's not even a single organization, cluster organization in Italy as such, but clusters are organic things that work in there. So I want to bring it here. I would like now to hear, what our colleagues can tell us from the experiences on Sonora and in Chile, which I think they have been working hard. They understand these constraints, I'm sure, and they are working hard to do policies that can overcome this idea of how we go from the resource base to the knowledge base. I will leave it here, and I think we can have questions and answers later. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much. Really, really fascinating and a really thorough overview. I particularly like the point about how the clay is no longer where the tiles are being made, and I think so often in local content we think of clusters being based around where the product is, and that's not always the case. And forward linkages, we see that especially where China and Japan make copper, they don't mine much copper. So I think it's really interesting, really fascinating. Let's turn now to can you screen there, Alberto?
Oh, absolutely. Here we go.
Alberto from the Sonora mining cluster. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here sharing and learning with all of you. We're going to share with you this morning our experience with Cluster Minero de Sonora. Sonora being the largest mining state in Mexico, sort of the comparative of Ontario to Canada, producing about 35% of the value of the mining production in the country. So starting off with just this chart that shows that clusters as formal organizations in Mexico are fairly new. They started back in 2012, and from that point on, every 2 years until the appearance of the Sonora mining cluster, we saw the top 3 mining states organizing in clusters. And they all have plus 100 partners in the Sonora mining cluster. We have 190 partners currently. We have a very nice growth there in associates. And more recently, we've also seen the appearance of mining clusters in states that not necessarily have mining as one of their predominant activities, but is nonetheless an important activity in the state, or the state wants to do something to foster mining or bring more investment into the state. That's the example, for example, of Sinaloa. What we've seen is that every cluster has its own different purpose, depending on the state they're in and the resources they have available. And we try to now more recently come together as all the clusters and try to share our experiences as well. So from these 190 partners or affiliates that we have in the Sonora mining cluster, how are they distributed? Who are they? And then how is the cluster organized, and how it works and how it's funded? Out of these 190, 21 are mining companies. You can see they're mostly grouped in the center of that circle diagram. They're all formal companies, so these would represent definitely not all of the operating companies in the state, but mostly the larger, medium to larger scale, although we do have as well some small miners as part of the cluster, and as well as exploration companies that have more recently started joining. We have 150 suppliers, so you can see that the suppliers make up most of the members of the cluster. In fact, the city of Hermosillo, the capital of Sonora, was, even before the formation of the cluster, was a natural cluster, and we like to say that it's the mining capital of Mexico, where providers are mostly concentrated, and we have already started exporting to other states and even internationally the products and services that are produced in Hermosillo. We also have academia, 11 universities that are part of the cluster and that are actively participating. State government, that's one government institution, is part of the board of the cluster. However, we don't depend on government funding to support the cluster. And then we have 7 other associations and business chambers, or other nonprofit organizations, mostly around mining. The way it's funded, it's by contributions of all of the members from the cluster. That, and as well for other activities, we have as well, like events and that type of thing, we also charge as well, or have a sponsorship to fund the activities. But most of our funding comes from the contributions of the members of the cluster. How we are organized, well, we have what we call an assembly that's formed by the 190 members. That they're the highest form of let's say the mandate comes from the assembly. But then the board of directors, which is formed by a selection of the companies, including mining companies and providers. It's the regulatory body of the cluster, and then we have a general direction that it's really the leadership of the day-to-day work, and that they do a lot of work in the cluster. And then we have 6 commissions and 2 work committees, and this is where a lot of the work that we do in the cluster happens. We, like to think that on the way we work in the cluster as a quadruple helix framework, and you see 4 colors here in the diagram. Obviously, in the dark color, we have the private sector with mining companies and suppliers. They're forming that largest part of our diagram I was showing earlier. So that's where our mining companies and suppliers are being a part of this. But then we also have the government, which is important. It may not be one of the largest parts of our cluster, but it's an important one because we want to have that permanent dialogue and cooperation with government in our mining industry in the country. Then we have, say, the community or the social, just society in general, organized civil society and communities, where we try to have that participation as much as possible as well, to have that input in molding the work we do, because we ultimately want to create benefit for the general public. And then the universities, because academia as well is important in researching or in creating alliances to study the different initiatives that we have. So that's sort of our model. That's why we try to incorporate pieces of all these of this quadruple helix. And going back just for a second into our diagram here, all those 4 parts are represented in our membership in the cluster. I talked about the work commissions that are 6. These have been growing. It's been interesting because the cluster has been taking on a life of its own. And more recently, we added a new commission, which is the communication commission. That's our most recent one, which we saw a strong need the sector was seeing to communicate better. But our key commission, we would say, is the Suppliers Development Commission, where what we focus on is on trying to connect local suppliers with the mining industry directly on one-on-one meetings on events all across the state, to try to find the business opportunities for people who might either not be in business yet, or who might be in business but does not know the mining environment, the mining industry, and might want to have an opportunity at getting there. This is a great part of what the Suppliers Development Commission does. We have others like the Human Resources Commission, which mostly focuses on improving our labor force, as well as in trying to foster the local labor force around the mining operations. The Sustainability Commission, which focuses on best practices around our mine sites. And we have an event coming this November, which we have called Innovation. It's mostly an innovation, social innovation event that we have been putting together now for the 5th event this time around. We're very successfully, where we try to expand our circle of influence beyond the mining community. Already mentioned communication. Security is always at the top of our concerns in mining. And then innovation is one commission that has recently transformed from being previously the Science Commission. And who's in all these commissions is mostly the people from the mining companies, the providers, the NGOs that I showed previously, and they're putting all their time and effort into trying to come up with great things for the mining industry. We have as well the committees. One is the mining cluster of Sonora. Until recently was the only one cluster that was the promoter for RSE, which is social corporate responsibility. That means that we can help our members who do not have social CSR practices established. We can help them do that and even get certified on that. We've been doing that for 3 years now, and other clusters have started replicating that. And our other committee is on our magazine, which is our main external communication effort with the digital magazine, Mining for All, Minería para Todos. So that's how we're structured, that's how we work. One highlight, or one thing that we could highlight that we have done, is the supplier certification for new suppliers. That we call this the silver level. So that's for companies that are not as sophisticated, that might be new, that don't have as much ability to improve themselves. We made this silver certification level, but we also had a copper level, where we go with people from communities who have no business experience and want to get in and supply a service, and then we train them. And we're also thinking now of a goal level, which is in process, where we want to even improve further the abilities of the companies and members. So what we see in the cluster is the benefit of having this an integrated value chain for companies. It has a number of benefits, like creating that value and competitive advantage, having more innovation. For society, it's not only getting the ability to enter the mining industry, but also in a way to communicate with the mining industry more readily. And with government, we help them attract the investment into their different regions and improve competitiveness. So what are the overall advantages that we see in clusters, and what we've been seeing in our Sonora mining cluster? It helps reduce the learning curve for new providers that may want to get into the industry, who have not been in there and want to learn how to do it. We help our members in training, both providers and mining companies. And this third point, I think, is a really important one, because we've been working hard on it. We promote an environment of learning and innovation. And this is, I think, in our particular experience, one point in which we've been really good at, that we've been successful at, and we see our members being happy with it. We give the identity and common direction to the different actors of the same industry, share the good practices, and of course, contribute to improving the public image, which is a great challenge nowadays. Finally, just a couple more slides. We have gone international in a number of ways, in alliances with a number of countries, which is great as well, because we can bring experiences from different countries into Sonora, like Chile, Peru, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Sweden, and we hope to get more soon. So it's really fast to try to stay within my 10 minutes, but hopefully, if you want to learn more, do visit us in Sonora, the mining heart of Mexico soon. You can follow us well on our social media.
Great, thank you so much, Alberto. Andres, if you mind sharing your screen, we'll just start doing that. Alberto, really fascinating. I mean, what I take away from that, which is, I think a key lesson, is that you're not doing just one thing. You're working on certification, you're working on CSR, you're working on communications, and I think that really, emphasizes the point that making local content and economic linkages is an all-system approach. It requires sort of pushing on all those levers at once, and not just sort of relying on one policy for local procurement, or one supplier development program. It's a much more multifaceted thing. So really exciting to see that kind of in the flesh, so to speak, with your initiatives. So thanks very much, and look forward to hearing more in the Q&A. Just a reminder before we turn to Grace, that if you have questions, you can start typing them in the Q&A, in the chat, and then I'll read those aloud during the Q&A. And of course, when we get to the Q&A, people can also unmute themselves and ask questions too. So just a reminder there. So Andres, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff, for the invitation. So I'm Andres Mitnick. I'm business director of Expande, and Expande is actually a platform, and we in Chile we use a combination of cluster theory. I attended Porter's microeconomicness of competitiveness class, actually, but I think we combine this with what's called the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program of MIT, and develop kind of an implementation entity that discuss more about developing an ecosystem that a cluster in the way we formerly know clusters. And I'm going to show you in a while why do I think that. By the way, Expande currently works with BHP, Codelco, Antofagasta Minerals, Altec, all big mining corporations, but we also have funding from Corfo, which is our economic development agency, and also the IDB. So why cannot move this? Okay, so we are an open innovation platform. And why are we using open innovation to develop actually a cluster? Basically, we have the traction here. We have the copper mines, and they are where they are. So that's our advantage, that you need to take out the copper from here. But in that regard, we're very dependent on copper for our economy. We have tried several different ways in how to lower the dependency, but the truth is that in the 80s, 50% of our exports were copper, and today 50% of our exports are copper, plus or minus, depending on the year and the price. And it makes no sense for us to build cables because we have the copper, very different capabilities, but it makes sense for us to develop technology around extracting copper, because that's where we see our advantage. And that's why Expande is a public-private initiative. We are neutral to the ecosystem, but basically we use open innovation to bring the challenges of the mining industry to an ecosystem of technological suppliers that can access them. So we lower entry barriers, and we develop and we allow these challenges to be available to the market, so companies can foster and create new technologies around this. Given the scale of local mining companies, if you put a new technology in a mining local operation, it's probably competitive worldwide. So at the same time, the suppliers we're helping to develop are becoming world-class by definition, because everything they're doing is new and it's innovative and it's competing with the best technology in the world. And that's what we call open innovation. For those of you who are not really clear, open innovation means you come out, you pose a problem, and the intellectual property and the business and everything is on the supplier side, but it's a new way to incorporate technology. This comes from an arrangement from public policy to a design to an implementation, and I'm going to touch those three topics because I think they are relevant. Basically, the public policy came because of a problem. Mining industry need to do something to ensure its sustainability. Chile is a mining country, but mining doesn't have the best reputation. We have very high environmental standards. The people here is actually very committed to the environment. So basically, in 2014, it was decided that we need to have a big country agreement in order for the industry to develop and to set the rules, the regulation, and an agenda that will allow this industry to continue to grow in Chile. And that was an effort that was led by former President Lagos, who put together a very broad set of people and got a document. And broad, I mean politicians, civil society, NGOs, mining corporations, very, very broad. And they came up with this document. It was called Mining, a Platform for the Future of Chile. That document was the kind of stepping stone that was taken afterwards by which is our local development corporation, in a policy that was originally it was clusters, but then it changed towards kind of strategic programs. But it has the same background. Basically, design innovative industrial policy, and by that I mean that what government interventions can be made that don't distort the market, but actually promote for things to happen that are not happening by themselves. In Expande, we're developing this innovation ecosystem around mining that hasn't happened in the last 40 years by itself. Now that we are on it, it's happening. So that's the type of policy that these strategic programs were looking for. And they developed a roadmap, which was called From Mining to Technology. And the roadmap exercise was very valuable because it created social capital. So it brought together the industry, the suppliers, academia, and the public sector, and all them define what were the challenges and design a set of solutions to address those challenges. And by the end of that, when the roadmap was ready, there was consensus on what needed to be done. Even though Corfo is usually a financing institution, in this case was taking the role of the designer of the policy. So we decided that they couldn't design and fund a policy. We needed to have some checks and balance in place because these roadmaps, this is one out of 10 roadmaps that were developed, have specific activities that wants to be funded, but you need those check and balances. And that's why we created the Strategic Investment Fund, which was hosted in the Ministry of Economy. It was originally way larger than the 160 millions that actually deployed. But the thing is that we had a private-public board with the intention of bringing together the information of the private sector together with the information of the public sector, and also not to avoid any capture from the public or from the private sector. So the investment board of this fund were 5 ministers of the government and 3 very senior representatives of the private sector. The strategic programs would apply to funding from the strategic investment fund, and then this board would select which activities to fund and which not to fund. And in that way, we have a very broad design and a consensus, but at the same time, the check and balances that there was no capture, not from the public, not from the private sector in the funding of this agenda. For the case of mining, we actually fund 8 initiatives, all of them private. We have private and public funds, kind of, that was the test. And Expand is one of them. Expand is it received $10 million in funding, 50% coming from the public sector and 50% coming from the public sector. And as you can see, there are several institutions that actually are managing these programs. Fundación Chile, which hosts Expand, manage a couple more. But this ecosystem development is not only one initiative, it's a portfolio of initiatives, all geared toward let's use mining to diversify our economy and depend less on mining. So basically, the end design has 3 pieces. We have Altalay program, which is the new version of what was the original mining strategic program. Now it's an entity by itself and has its own. It's an institution right now, and that provides the political support and the coordination activities. So they coordinate all this agenda and all this portfolio, and also they help identify new funding for new initiatives. Then we have the ecosystem, and that design actually comes from MIT, where we include everyone. So it's not only suppliers and mining corporations that are the ones that are really related to, but also risk capital, also the government, and also academia. So that's what we call the innovation ecosystem, and that's what we're developing. And there are different implementation programs, Expand being one of those. We have another program around interoperability, another program around tailings, and the whole set that I showed before. Coming to Expand and how to develop this ecosystem, because we're kind of the main implementator of the ecosystem development, we have the following principles. Differently to a typical cluster design, we developed a club, and the members of this club are mining companies. So we only charge mining companies for the service we provide them. We don't charge anything to the suppliers or to the rest of the ecosystem. Why? Because the ecosystem development is being funded by public funds. Also, we tried this very many times before, since the 80s, so we have a lot of lessons learned. So this time we did to focus on real problems from operations. We want implementation. So our KPIs are how many contracts we help sign and how much funding is deployed to suppliers around mining. We also have a very clear strategy and try to grow, as you will see. Other initiatives started at a very high level and had a very low implementation level. And then we also wanted to move from corporate social responsibility to actually have a value proposition that generates value to the mining corporations. We think this is the way to be sustainable, and it's a strategy that has proven successful so far. The design of Expande is actually like a startup, and that's also very different from other initiatives. When we have 2 big areas. When we knew that we were going to manage challenges from the mining industry, and we knew that we were going to use open innovation, so we were going to go to an innovation ecosystem for them to solve it. But how were those methodologies? How do you develop an ecosystem? What are the kind of products, services, activities that you need to put together? That was an unknown, and we actually are inventing new things and changing all the time. The same as with our strategy. So by having this entity that actually behaves as a startup, we're able to adapt a lot and to create new things, and that's has been one of the interesting things of the implementation. Technology are guys that know a lot about mining, talk to the mining companies, talk to their specialists, are the guys who assess the suppliers and work very closely in the challenges. And business has a lot to do with helping suppliers scale, with access funding, with developing the ecosystem, with making this international. And actually this design has been proven so successful that now similar initiatives are being deployed in Australia, in Peru, and soon we're going to find one in Germany. But it's not only policy and design. the trick here is a lot about implementation, and that's why I'm going to talk a moment on that. And the devil is in the details, and these are the details. So basically, open innovation has many things. We're not in all of them. We're in the idea contest, we're in scale up, we do scouting and networking. We adapt to each of our clients. We treat every single mining company differently, and we constantly create new ways for suppliers to engage, to collaborate, and to expand their business. And that's why we have focus and we are not into everything. Secondly, our role is to bridge the gap between innovation and industry. And for that, we created a database, we do scouting, we go internationally. We don't have local content restrictions. The only local content restriction we have is when someone signs an implementation and it's a foreign company, you need to have some sort of local content, which is discussed on a case-to-case basis. And to support the ecosystem, we do mentoring. We do not provide funding, but we do those linkages, and we help scale. Basically, mining corporations, it's very hard for them to identify where innovation is coming up and where it's arising because it's very random, and it's expensive to have that kind of platform. So we bridge that gap by having a dedicated platform to that serves different mining companies as well as the ecosystem, the suppliers ecosystem. This is more about our opinion, but this is totally different from a tender. We do not want to provide very detailed rules to be able to compare apples to apples. On the contrary, we fall in love with problems because we want diversity and we want to see apples, oranges, peaches. We want to see new ways to address the problems because the problems we manage, if companies would been able to solve them with their regular methodology, they wouldn't come to us. So we need to offer something new. As I mentioned, this is the process. Expanded sits in the middle. We are neutral and we articulate this network. Our challenge process is honestly, it's not rocket science. We have the traction, which is very relevant. So we have mining companies on board. That's the heart of the initiative. But then they give us our challenges. We do the scouting. We have no bias from very small suppliers to large suppliers to research centers, startups. And then we come back to them and show them what we find. Again, we have different methodologies for different companies, but that's not the rocket science. We do have a platform, so we have a webpage where we post our challenges, and they're open, some of them globally, some of them locally, but we're basically constant feed of opportunities for suppliers to engage. And we always say, if you have something new, if you think that you can solve mechanical stability uses data science, come to us. We're open and we're gonna review it. We also have a scaling portfolio. We have so far helped 40 companies in different levels, from preparing value propositions to product market fit, to raise funding, to go internationally. And basically what we do is we articulate a network, we have inside knowledge, we transfer the knowledge, and we help them grow. This is a 5-month program for each company. Then we have several events. We need to activate the ecosystem. You cannot just kind of put challenges and hope things happen by themselves. So when we have a successful implementation, we developed an event for mining companies to share the information and to show it to others so others can implement these technologies. We have master classes where we transfer specific knowledge to suppliers that might not have the knowledge of the mining industry. And we also host events among venture capitalists and suppliers that would fit that kind of match. Recently, we ran a disruptive challenge. The biggest thing we have ever done was the BHP tailings challenge. It's a 10 million challenge focused on developing an industry about repurposing of tailings. What happened? This is a good example of how we kind of create new things. We were talking to startups in Australia, larger companies in the US, and a cluster in Germany. These guys would have never met before to be able to tackle such a challenge. So we actually created a platform. We created a community. This is an open community. People sign in and start a conversation that we actually don't manage. We just provide a community and do some events, but this is organic. So the idea here was for a meeting space for companies to meet and strengthen their proposals and then apply to the challenge. And this was something that we're trying to scale now to develop to the rest of the ecosystem. Then we have a lot of publications. Every successful implementation, we try to make it as public as we can. So we publish them, we showcase them in our webpage. We do social media. So basically, we devoted ourselves to make sure that every single supplier that has something that has been valued for a mining company can scale it as much as they can. And basically, I think the biggest takeoff of this is that mining companies change when they are exposed to innovation. They have developed new processes. Some of them, if you come within their with their innovation track, you don't need to go through a tender afterwards. Some of them are funding the pilots, what's called kind of venture client. But they all have make some organizational changes that allow them to be more permeable to innovation, and we think that that's one of the biggest impact of Expande. And just to show you some numbers and to put some meat behind my words, right now we're working with 19 mining operations. We produce 20% of global copper production. We have a database of over 1,200 suppliers. We've managed so far 173 challenges. This started from very little to many. This year we expect to manage at least 70, and that's growing. We have helped sign 123 contracts for 32 million. Those contracts, very few of them would have come to play if it wasn't because there was someone activating this ecosystem. And also we have worked with 53 startups, which together they have raised a bit more than $9 million. And I'm gonna leave it there to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks a lot.
Amazing, great. Another amazing presentation, and I think showing the same point about the sort of all of system approach being needed to make these things work, and then throwing in the innovation function, which I think is particularly exciting for other countries to look at. So that's the presentations. Now we have a Q&A, and there's some questions in the chat already. I'd actually love to hear, Emiliano, if you have any reflections first, because you're the expert on this on a theoretical level. So if you feel like you need to unmute though.
Yeah, I would just maybe like to thank for sharing these presentations and to clarify a little bit the definitions. I mean, cluster organizations versus clusters. Okay, cluster organizations are just organizations. You know, it's an entity that groups people. You know, a cluster is an organic, natural, animal that grows spontaneously and between the relations between companies. Okay. Cluster organizations are administrative entities. Okay, so I just want to make that differential. We're not talking of the same things when Alberto and I are talking. We're talking of two different things. And the same way that what has been presented by Andres, it's a platform, an innovation platform, but it talks about Chile. You know, one of the more important things of clusters is the geographic component. In Chile, the mining in Atacama or the mining in Tarapacá is very different, and there are very different, not only the products, but the value chain is different, the agents in the value chains are different. So those are different clusters, and you saw that when I show you the clusters, the mining clusters in the United States, we go to county level in the United States. We never will use, a country which 4,000 kilometers long to put it as a single. So we're talking of different animals, all of us, okay? And also time-wise, I'm not talking about what happens while you have a mining operation, which of course, when you have a mining operation, you have companies, you have problems to solve. I mean, all the list of problems that was presented by Andres are operational issues that you find in a mining operation. When you talk about clusters and the transition between clusters and clusters of knowledge is, what happens when there's no mine? What will you do when there is no mine? What will be the technologies and things? What will happen when there will not be any more mines there? Will you exist or not? That will mean that you have transformed from a mine or an extractive-led facility to a cluster, which is based on knowledge and interaction of companies. So this is the key question, For us, for me, it's more important to look at what happens in a place where there's no more oil in Houston. Okay, there's no more oil, but we still have plenty of companies that do that. In Finland, it's a very interesting example. No more copper mining, but Outokumpu, when it broke down, he created Autotech, which has 250 guys in Santiago. No, that is what I mean. This is we're talking, the three of us, of different things. How do we run things while the operation is there? Of course, the case of Sonora, there is like any industry association, people get together to defend their interest, and they will defend it as incumbents there, and they try to improve. Or as Andres, I have companies, big companies have problems. I will create an open platform to solve their issues. I'm talking of what happens after all this is gone, or what do you need to do now to make sure that after that is gone, you have already some strategic issues. Okay, that's what I think. What will you do? What will Chile will be good at when there's no more copper in Chile? Okay, what are you developing there? Will you then selling your biolixivation skills for solving that problem the rest of the world? Or you should have focused in being the accounting and treasury management for mining operations in Latin America. Okay, like the Swiss are the treasury managers and for many of the big multinationals in Europe that they're managing from there because that's what they became. Yeah. So it is a timing issue that what we need to bring is are you trying to optimize what you have now, or are you preparing what you have now in order in the future when the mine is gone? When the mine is there, you always are going to have a value chain. You're always going to have, better or worse, you can improve it, but you are there. The reason of the mine creates its own value chain. The question, and I think the objective of this is, of this today, it was, how do you use this? I mean, can we prepare the things so for when after the mine? Will we be able to develop those skills up to the world level to do that? Do our partners need to? I see there's a question here about national companies and not. Well, do we need to work with BHP, or BHP will just move to somewhere else because their interest is not just to develop in Chile? That is just they want to optimize there. So do we really need to work with the multinationals, or the multinationals are the ones which will keep moving from one place to another? These are the questions that I would like to be discussed and to raise, because I think that's the objective of development. Our objective is not making the mines more efficient in operation. That, the big guys can do that very well. They don't need the governments, they don't need the World Bank, they don't need any of us to make their operations efficient. Our objective is, how do we make sure that, that resource which has been taken from a population, brings revenue in the form of taxes or anything that need to do, but also can be used for developing future knowledge, based clusters that will prevail for centuries. That's I think where I think we need to match the three speech together. Thank you.
Can I react to that, Jeff?
Of course.
Sure. So I think that's exactly what we're doing, actually, because Expande is not meant to solve the problem of the mining industry, but to develop an ecosystem of technological suppliers that then can export by themselves. So the idea is, when there's no more mining in Chile, we have developed kind of the Finnish case. We have developed an industry of technological suppliers, which is knowledge intensive, that can go and export, so they don't depend on the local mining companies. Also, there's a window of opportunity because right now there's a lot of Industry 4.0 implementation going on. And in that regard, many of the suppliers we work with are in the digital realm, or in the Industry 4.0, which is very horizontal to several industries. So what we do in mining probably works with forestry, probably works with power generation, with many other natural resources. And in that regard, given that the investment required to run these kind of companies, which are smaller but very knowledge intensive, is different from a big equipment supplier, we have the opportunity to actually capture that market and move forward to it. And I think that's what's interesting about Expande, that we have been able to find an opportunity, find the traction, and find kind of the precise moment to create a new industry in Chile that don't depend on mining, but can be much more horizontal and actually a global competitive.
So can I now? I think this is an interesting thing. Yes, that's a purpose. But when you do an open platform like this, you need to make sure that you identify areas of the future where they are not in mining. So you cannot then. I mean, we teach a case which is about the oil drilling cluster in Norway, in the Kristiansand area, which started basically as making oil drilling equipment. Okay, and this is a case was written with Innovation Norway, and I was supervising that case, and I taught it last week. That's why I had it fresh. And basically, the problem that we had is that they were focusing on the oil industry, and the future was not the oil industry, it was something else. You know what that cluster is doing? First, they changed the name of cluster from oil industry to blue ocean strategies, or the green development. They are doing now aquaculture in deep seas. How many projects are you doing in aquaculture, Andres? You should be doing one, because the technologies that you have are the same. Eh?
We do have one in agriculture, because the desalinated
aquaculture.
Yes,
aquaculture.
I know. The desalination plant from Escondida needed to assess the quality of the water, because marine elements would come into the pipe and would kind of create problems. Right. That was addressed by a company that did data science with satellite images. They are using the same technology and the same algorithms in the agriculture industry. So that's the kind of transfer that I'm referring to.
You really need to be open. If you really want to be open, do not let the mining companies choose your projects. If you want it to be open it to everybody else, like these guys in Norway. I will send you a Norwegian case. They have renewable energies. They're doing wind energy on the sea. They're doing all the things which are the new societal challenges. They use the technologies that metallurgical, mechatronics, they use the same technologies that they were using for the oil industry, but they're making sure that they're really opening to where the economy. And your economy, your future of your economy, it's on the agriculture and aquaculture technology, not on the mining. That doesn't finish. That's a renewable energy. Your avocados, your paltas, that's a renewable energy that you can. You're exporting more grapes today than you were exporting copper 20 years ago. Think of that, okay, in value. So this idea that these open platforms, they have to be great, but they really have to be open. They're not just a platform to the service of the industry that's existing today, because, well, as you say very well, you want to focus on the future. That's my only.
No, totally. I mean, our goal would be to expand our platform to other industries. I would totally agree with that. This is, I would say, and that's this kind of the startup behavior. This is only the beginning. I wouldn't like expand it to be limited to mining, because the methodology can be applied to several others and create much more value, just as you are describing.
Yeah, but that's important. You have too many ministers in your boards, too many big companies. If you have the corporates in your boards, how are you going to change? How are you going to tell BHP that, no, I'm not going to work for you, I'm going to work for the aquaculture guys? So the Norwegians, they had to get rid of all those guys. They had to change their board. They had to change their cluster manager, because those cluster organizations were too rigid. They were focused in servicing one client. When you really need it is what you are saying. Open, mix apples with other things, because that's what we do. Mix apples with avocados and with salmon, and there we go. And because they really need all these technologies. I think that's important. One of the big problems of clusters, they close in themselves. They're close and they protect each other instead of, opening to others.
Great. Maybe Alberto, I don't know if you just have anything to add on this obviously really important point about diversifying.
Yeah, no, I thought I picked up some interesting points there about the clusters. Obviously, here, even going back to the definition of cluster, we have both the cluster as a formal organization here in Mexico, or the Sonora Mining Cluster, but also the city of Hermosillo is a cluster of providers that now organically occurs, as well as we have other mining clusters around the state. Where we have actual clusters of mining operations there occurring. And yes, to the question of what happens after these mining operations close, we have had, as an organization, a number of efforts. I don't think it's large, and that's an area where we can definitely improve, but we've had a number of efforts, mostly in the form of events. In our case, when we have started discussing this point, what happens when the mine ends, and how can at least individual mining operations, as individual case studies, how can they help transform the local economy into something that will be more sustainable? That's from our end what we have been doing.
Great. Let's go to some Q&A on the chat, and then like I say, we can also take some questions verbally. But I'll just start off with one from Francisco, who asked the clusters in Mexico. Are they are they communicating between each other, or is each one managed independently? And I know that they are sort of independent organizations, but I think it would be very interesting to hear sort of how that dynamic works between those clusters, because you mentioned all those they were formed rather quickly. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts, Alberto.
Yeah, they're all independently formed. They're all in their very own initiatives, and they have happened differently as well. In some cases, they have been more fostered by local government or state governments. In some other cases, more promoted by the mining industries. In some cases, even a combination of both. I think that was the case for Sonora, where mostly industry-led, but with some cooperation of state government. We came to create the Sonora mining cluster. We do communicate among each other, but we are not, let's say, organized formally as mining clusters. We all have our different purposes and ways of organizing and funding.
Great, thanks. First, actually, does anyone have a question to ask if they want to unmute themselves and ask the questions before I go to another chat one? Gone. I'll go to the chat. So there's a question from Binta, who asked, Alberto, can you explain a little more on how the Sonora mining cluster started? Was it the companies who pushed the establishment of the cluster, or was it an NGO? How did it sort of come about?
Yeah, it was a combination of companies and government, but I would say it was more industry-led, more the companies that were in the state were interested in doing cluster, and then some dialogue started happening with state government, and then finally decided to create a cluster. And state government is part of the cluster, but not funding the cluster. So we are a nonprofit organization that really funds itself by the donations of the different members.
Great, thanks. Anyone else with a question verbally? Just have to unmute yourself on the mic if you want to ask.
Jeff, hi, this is Sven.
Hi, Sven.
Thanks, Emiliano, I found your presentation really great. So my question, or my thinking was, I just posted it on the chat, but I'm repeating it, is what you're saying is that clusters developed over centuries, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So my question is, if those clusters developed in an environment and in a time where there was much less mobility, and also mobility of knowledge, and does that affect cluster creation today? I mean, do we still have an environment in which clusters can be created if you can sort of mobilize knowledge from wherever you want? I'm thinking of, the best cars are built in southern Germany, and in a couple of cities that are very nearby. But today you have a situation in which Tesla, in 5 years' time, can build a car that's entirely competitive in an entirely different place. So how does that play out for sort of other situations and cluster building?
Thank you, Sven. That's a very good question, but you need to separate two things: the world and Elon Musk. So they work in two different wavelengths. So one of the paradoxes we found in cluster with mobility is that knowledge tend to concentrate even more. So the effect of Silicon Valley, it's the opposite. Why there is not everywhere. There was an interesting study done by an Italian professor of China, with the development of manufacturing in China. Most of the manufacturing cities in China, they're specialized in things which are already specialized before the Chinese Revolution. So it's very curious, And sometimes there are also Porter found interesting evolutions. The fiber optics cluster in Japan, it's in the same place where they developed silk originally, because their skill was making long, thin things. Okay, So this idea that this mobility will allow clusters to develop many other places, it's really not happening. It really, falls into, there has to be something. That example of southern Norway I mentioned in Kristiansand, they used to make shipping, and they used to make deep sea shipping, and so. And very curious, you have a strong colony when they have lots of people from Houston living there. So basically, Houston has a subsidiary there. So in these clusters, you end up having an international school. The only elementary international school in Norway is in Kristiansand. Why? Because the guys from there are there. So at the end, we are in a global world with lots of connections, but they connect with each other. These Canadians and these Swedes, the Finns, they go to there, and then there are the Australians in Chile. So it's not just a global thing, but it's a connection of clusters, which is more global and more interconnected than before. That's true. It's much more interconnected than before, but it's not new things. You are connecting old nodes. It's almost like all neurons that are there, and they then make synapses again with the new there. And that's interesting because sometimes you need to build on that. You already had something, so that's a good way to develop it. And then with Elon Musk, I look at the factory. I look at this Tesla factory, but from the Google, it's like that. It's in the middle of the desert, nothing, along. It's almost like an Extractive, and it's in Nevada. So he thinks, the subsidy per person is $22 million per job. He subsidized $22 million per job. He's not an idiot. Okay, so he put that factory there against all logical things just to get these subsidies. Okay, the state of Nevada, the state, the federal, everybody. And then he got to go and plead to the guys in Detroit to go to live in Nevada because nobody knows how to assemble a car there. Okay, so it kind of reinforces this idea, and we have this example in many automotive plants. I know a professor that explained that when General Franco wanted to build cars in Spain, and Spain was an autarky, he wrote to Mr. Agnelli and told him, build me a factory, whatever it is, I want it here in Madrid. And then Mr. Agnelli said, no, I'm going to do it, but only if I do it in Barcelona, because there, before the war, they were already making cars, So there is a knowledge there. So the first factory was in Barcelona, because there was something. So there are many of these white elephants that we have across the world, which are basically decisions like that. We're going to put this here, which is a non-cluster, so the anti-cluster, and those end up typically being white elephants. When they're there because we gave them subsidies, we gave them, something, entice them in there. The moment those money goes out, that will go. What is the next factory of Tesla in Europe? In Central Europe, in Germany.
Say that again, please.
So the next factory of Tesla in Europe is in Germany.
Exactly. Yeah.
next to the guys that know how to make good cars.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And when you were talking, you reminded me of something that a couple of days ago I read about the constraints that UWay had in chip design and chip building. Because my thinking always was, the technology is there. Why shouldn't, I just assumed that there was a high capability of building chips in China, but it isn't the case. They are very much relying on technology that really comes from the US and the machinery that is built in the US in order to create those 6 nanometer chips that in Taiwan they are produced, but not in China.
The famous Intel investment in Costa Rica, who my former trade and competitiveness director was the minister that did that and had to see it gone because, no, it didn't work. Costa Rica does not have the environment. You are not going to be able to do that. Had they invested that money in avocados, and, today they would be doing what Chile and Peru are doing, but they put it on microchips because it was fancy.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Thank you so much.
Great. I've got a question from the chat from Iwana, who asked, where did we go? Sorry, I just lost my space. How did, for both the initiatives, how did you assess the role of domestic mining firms? Maybe, to broaden that question out, how did you sort of approach them to take part? I personally have had a lot of experience in Africa where or there have been sort of initiatives, and they've had a very difficult time getting mining companies to take part. So I'd be interested to know about the assessment process for the mining firms, as well as how you sort of got them on board for both those.
Sure. Can you?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. It's been interesting here in Mexico. I think for most of the mining companies, it has not been a problem. As I mentioned a moment ago, they were also very much interested in getting the cluster formed and going. So it was in great part an initiative of the companies. They wanted to participate. They wanted to be part of this, and they wanted to have a cluster through which they could do a number of initiatives. So for the most part, it hasn't been a problem. It has been more of a challenge with the non-producing companies, the exploration companies, which we are also interested in bringing in because we want to have the entire all the steps of the process, of the mining process, in, so that we can align each of those steps in the industry. There, I think that they have a harder time seeing the value. Well, it hasn't been a challenge really with the operating companies.
And for the case of Chile, it started small and it grew. It began out of the urgency that something needed to be done for mining companies to kind of live more in the country or contribute more to the country, as a way to get the social license to operate. That was kind of the first piece. And then we did this roadmap that I described in the presentation, where many stakeholders were brought together. There, though, we had, I would say, two champions initially, which basically was Codelco, which is state-owned, and BHP, which was very looking forward and to kind of do more for the local economy.
Great. Javier, we got a question from Javier.
Can I comment on this?
Yes, thanks, Jeff. No, thanks for the presentation. Are really quite interesting. Andres, I have a question following Emiliano's point regarding the clusters. I see that there is an evolution on the Chilean strategy on really to work and advance innovation. But is it really something quite different from the cluster idea? Because the cluster in itself has the idea of location, proximity of companies basically around the same industry. There's an agglomeration effect or spillovers or learning, collective action between all the companies basically pursuing some similar kind of objective. In the case of Expande, I see very much that it's very much of promoting innovation, but it is really something that the program is not building on that kind of agglomeration or cluster idea of collective learning. So are all these innovations taking place more or less from anywhere in Chile, connecting to other companies in the world? But how do you build on that kind of cluster effect that it seems to me that it's not part necessarily of what Expande is doing?
No, that's a good question. So basically, the location perspective of the cluster first comes. It's countrywide since mining is in Chile. So that's the advantage we're taking there. But also being a Latin American country, our economy is very concentrated. So we have a cluster of mining suppliers in Santiago. I didn't show the slide, but Santiago is the city with the highest number of active startups in mining in the world. And in that regard, in Santiago, using destruction is being developed this cluster of technological suppliers for mining, but as well for other industries as well, since many of them are digital. And also at Expande, we do a lot of work bringing together this ecosystem. So we provide this platform. We encourage suppliers to collaborate among each other to strengthen their value proposition to the mining companies. We also vertically. Like we try larger suppliers to work with smaller ones because mining companies don't want to have so many contracts as well. So we do those efforts to take advantage of what's more the traditional cluster theory, more by collaboration than by location. But location is given because it's Santiago. Chile is a very concentrated economy around Santiago.
Great. Emiliano, you had something you wanted to say just before that question.
Yeah, before that, I mean, this question of domestic, not domestic, I think the mining industry is always a domestic industry. Your resource is always national. Then you are giving the operation to a local company or an external company. But I think you need to have a good understanding that this is an industry where the operators are predators. You know, it is like fishing industry. You are taking a natural resource that belongs to that nation. You know, so your role of the mining companies, your role as a government is how do you assure that you will guarantee the maximum benefit for the national economy based on that. You know, that doesn't mean that you need to nationalize because that examples are not doing very well. But you know, what does this natural resource that you are giving away and selling once, you cannot sell it twice. It's not replenishable. You know, how do you assure that you're going to make the best use of that money? You may do this, or may just put the money in a fund and send everybody to study a PhD in MIT. You know, and that may be more profitable to your economy than trying to develop all these linkages that we're doing. But at the end of the day, it's always a domestic resource that you are selling outside of the country. I think we focus a lot on, if the company is national or national, it doesn't matter if it's national or national. If you are not extracting the proper value that the owners of that resource need. And I think this is so different from every other industry. All the other industries are non-finite. They can transform things, they can grow, they can replant, they can do. So therefore, you can take the time to say, I'm going to lose money this year because I'm going to make money in 20 years from now. This is not. You make the money now or you don't make it after 30 years. So, and I think this is a very different approach when you think of, licensing and things like this. This is not about, let's give these guys that, when we're starting manufacturing, let's give them a SE entrance so they come in and we learn manufacturing. This is, you have a finite number of revenue that you're going to be able to get from this. How do you capture maximum? This is what should be in the mind and not if it's owned nationally or not. I just wanted to bring this. It's so different from all the other clusters.
Great. Thanks so much.
I have a question for Andres, if there is a little bit of time.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. I really liked your presentation. It's certainly a different type of animal, the cluster organization that you were explaining. Now, the creation was inspired by the government, as you said. It's a vision. However, the realization is as open as it can be within the framework of a vision inspired by government. Naturally, even if you are open and you are inviting technology solution from wherever, you mentioned a little bit fleeting that there are some local requirements at some point, probably when you try to ground those solutions, technological solutions into the local economy. And I would like if you could elaborate a little bit more on the type of solutions that you have identified, be that the financing from the Strategic Investment Fund of startups or other mechanisms that allow you to capture these solutions that are sourced worldwide, but that are obviously to apply for the benefit of the Chilean economy.
Totally. Thanks, Silvana. So at Expande, there is also another location advantage, touching on the last question, because since we're in Chile, we're more connected to Chile than to any other place. So for example, we did this PHP tailings challenge, which was a global challenge. We got 153 submissions from 19 countries, but 66 of them were from Chile. So a third of them were from Chile. And that's basically because we're better known in Chile, our network is better in Chile, and our process, which is not kind of the regular process, it's also better understood in Chile. So the local ecosystem has an advantage just we're here. Secondly, most of the, not in the beginning, but I mean, this was always kind of thought from the public and the private sector. This all began with BHP and the World Class Suppliers Program, which was something that was implemented in the 2000s. Then Codelco went up, and then that mixed up with the government vision, and we got a new iteration that's called Expander right now. But when you ask us how do we get this local content, is basically we don't want to put restrictions because we feel like having technology transfer from abroad enriches our ecosystem. That's our thesis. Needs to be proven, but we're thinking on those grounds. That's why we don't put those restrictions around international players. Now, given that we have local funding and the mission from the government is to promote the local ecosystem, we need to take some actions to ensure that that happens, and we are not only importing technology, which basically we do very few of those 120 contracts. I think only 5 or 6 are companies from abroad. Most of them are local. But when a company from abroad works in mining, they need local knowledge because there are a lot of permitting, there are a lot of regulation, there's a lot of network that you need to have. You can go to a mine, and the guy, you won't be able to get into the door because you're lacking a permit, or because the champion that was supposed to receive you had an urgency and move away, and you cannot be flying from, let's say, Norway to Chile, not to enter a mine and go back. So that's why we left it open, and we said we know there's going to be local content because by the industry we're working with requires it. We're not going to define it, but the mining companies, we ask them we prepare a document, and they committed to include local content when there's an implementation, not for a pilot, but only for an implementation, and to be negotiated on a case-to-case basis. Most of the time are these type of things, are kind of the permitting, the regulation, and basically when you have a service contract, you need to have people here on the ground to service that contract. And that's the way we've approached it. We still need to prove that works the way we thought, but we're working on that.
Sorry, if I ask a follow-up question on the strategic investment fund, could you define a little bit more what its role is in this vision?
Absolutely. So the strategic investment fund was meant to fund initiatives, not companies. So the suppliers that Expander work with venture capitalists, regular financing, not the strategic investment fund funded Expander and the rest of the agenda. That was sort of a venture capital from the government. Originally, it was $1 billion fund, but then the price of copper went down and everything, and all budgets came down. But the idea was for these strategic programs to prepare portfolio of projects that would be then assessed by this strategic investment fund to have all the check and balances in place. There might be some confusion of what I presented. We have 5 ministers. We have the Ministry of Economy, of Finance, of Agriculture, of Mining, and I don't remember the last one. And then the private sector was represented by the chairman of Telefónica, the chairman of the North American Chamber of Commerce, and someone from the venture capital industry. And these guys what they were looking for were for projects that were able to add complexity to our economy. That was kind of the goal. Sometimes it funded regulation. So, for example, it funded an initiative that was around regulation to build mid-sized structures out of wood, because only concrete is eligible now. That's a good new thing for Chile because we have a lot of timber and we have a whole industry around, and we could move that to construction. Other things were expanded. We're actually a platform. A different thing would be the interoperability program that is about creating standards for machines and systems to interoperate and reduce entry barriers so you are not captured by large suppliers. those were the kind of programs that the Strategic Investment Fund assessed and funded. And they didn't fund everything that they saw. Actually, I worked there for a while, so I know very, very closely. And some initiatives were considered not new, not interesting, or didn't add the value the fund expected, so they were rejected. So it was and there's an IDV study around it, but it was kind of the public sector getting rid of the best practices from the private sector to fund private initiatives.
Great. Great. Thanks so much. It is, we are on top of the hour, so we are at the end of our time. I'm glad to say that we've continued our streak of ending with more questions, in the doc. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these questions posted in the COP. So everyone who's not a member, again, you can email myself or Kyla DeWert to become a member. We'll have the questions posted on the community of practice after we put a summary up, and then we can have the speakers answer those remaining questions. And then those who have other questions, they can also ask questions on that same summary post. So we'll send a follow-up with that to our members. Again, thanks so much. It's been a really great discussion, one of our liveliest so far. And we'll see people on the community of practice online to keep the discussion going. Okay. I want to and thanks, of course, to all our speakers. A really amazing job. I know that Alberto had to duck out really quickly. So thank you so much, Emiliano, for sort of setting the table and then getting into the practical experience, Andres and Alberto. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the conversation. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.